Okay, maybe towards the end. Awesome. Well, thanks for showing up, guys. Looks like a good turnout. You guys are all excited about migratory fish, which is cool. So am I. That's one of my favorite things to do. So thanks for the introduction. My name is Jason Swingen. I'm a fly fishing guide based out of Duluth with Namabini. So I know many of you guys, but not all of you. If you don't know me, many of you probably know Carl Hansel, who wrote the book on fly fishing Minnesota. We're out there all the time, mainly spring, summer, and fall, migratory fishing, trout fishing, smallmouth bass, all the good stuff on the fly. I also have a blog, jsoutdoors.com, so if there's something that I didn't cover today, feel free to check that out. There's a couple good articles on there that can help you out. And then I am the president of the Gitchigumi chapter of Trout Unlimited. I'm going to do just a quick little plug for our little chapter. We have lots of cool stuff, just like you guys do, river restoration, events, meetings. One thing that I do want to let you guys know about, if you don't know, we're trying to bring back an event called Paddle the Pads. It's in the summer. It's a fly fishing bass tournament in a canoe or kayak, stuff like that. It's usually in August, but it's a really fun event. It got a really good turnout this year. We even have the winner of the biggest bass sitting in this middle table, Deb Fenner, with a giant bass. So if you need any more push to come and check that event out, talk to the Fenners. They can vouch. It's a fun time. All right, enough about bass. I'm sure you guys are excited about that, but you're probably here for migratory fish. So let's get started talking about that. So just like many of you, you probably had a certain event that kind of got you into fishing, got you into fly fishing, got you into trout fishing. So this was the fish for me. I grew up doing bass fishing and walleye and ice fishing. And then my wife's cousin one day was just like, hey, let's just go throw some spoons out in Lake Superior and see what happens. And it was hours and hours and hours of just casting and nothing happening. And then all of a sudden, I have never caught a fish that just ripped lines so fast that it was just, and the fish was jumping out of the water. And it was the most exciting fish that I had caught to that date. And I needed more. So after I caught that one, I was like, oh, well, how do I catch more of these fish? They go in the rivers. How do I catch them in the rivers? And then it's a slippery slope to where I am today, talking to you guys about fishing. So this is kind of who I am now, what I like to do. The migratory fish are really my favorite fish. So, and I'm sure if you guys all think there's probably a special fish or something that got you. I was just talking to this table, and they had gone out to the Brule last year and caught a giant king. So, and it sounds like they're hooked and they're coming back again. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So I'm going to cover a handful of different topics on Lake Superior migratory fish. Some of them may be a little boring, and then we're going to get into the little more cool technical stuff that will help you guys catch some fish on your own. But we'll start with talking a little bit about the history of Lake Superior. It seems like it's this thing that's always been around, but it's changed a lot in the past. We're going to cover a little bit of fish identification because there's quite a few different species out in the lake, their life cycles, some differences between the North Shore and South Shore, which is pretty great, and then when, where, how to catch these fish, and then we'll dive a little bit into the rigging technique, flies, and all the good stuff that you guys are probably here for. All right, so these are just a few of the fish that you can catch in the rivers that reside in the lake. They come into the rivers to spawn. So you can probably identify most of these on your own. Top left is a steelhead, a pretty nice one. And then right is a pink salmon. We have a migratory brown trout, and then a coaster brook trout, which is the migratory version of a brook trout. And then bottom left is a coho salmon, bottom right is a king salmon. And that's kind of the main targets for migratory fish. Primarily the steelhead, and then pinks, browns. The coasters are a fun fish. They're kind of harder to catch. They're not as many as there used to be, but we'll go into that in a little more detail. So I've already been out on the river. This is a couple of my clients from within the last week that have already been catching fish. So if you're looking to go out, there's already fish in the rivers ready to be caught. This left one, shiny steelhead, that one jumped a bunch, took him upriver, which sometimes they do, and they're a bright, shiny fish when they go up. Usually they go down or stay in the pool, but just some cool fights with these fish. The middle one, nice migratory brown, and then a younger king salmon. There's been a few kind of skipjack-sized king salmons around. So a little bit about the North Shore versus the South Shore, the geology and topography differences. So many of you have probably been to the North Shore and the South Shore. I'm sure you've fished it and at least visited if you haven't. You would think, just looking at it, oh, Lake Superior, there's all these fish in there. They will just go to the North or South Shore and everything's kind of the same. But there's vast differences between the North Shore and South Shore. So the North Shore of Lake Superior, primarily this section in that little background of Lake Superior, from Duluth all the way up into Canada, is very steep. Very few of our rivers are spring fed, so they are highly dependent on rainfall and water melt or snow melt in the spring. So in the spring, if we get enough snow, snow melts, that fills up the rivers, the fish come in. If it doesn't rain, the fish may leave. So it's not a specific time frame necessarily, but generally it's a mid-April to mid-May type of fishery. Somewhat limited habitat. We have more rivers on the North Shore, but the migratory sections of the North Shore are fairly short. So you may have heard the term a barrier in the context of above barriers brook trout or below barriers migratory fish. And a barrier is just a natural waterfall or something that the migratory fish can't get past. And some of these rivers on the North Shore, that's almost immediate. So the fish have very small area that they can get up into, as opposed to the South Shore, which is it's like a bigger version of the driftless. So it's spring fed, it's silty, there's some rocks, and there's different areas of it that support a diverse amount of habitat and bug life and food. So it's just a more typical kind of trout style of river. Yeah. So back in the day, before we had all of these different steelhead and salmon and everything, Lake Superior used to just be lake trout and brook trout, specifically the coaster brook trout. And then in the 1800s, a bunch of people came and we forested the land. We cut all the trees right next to the rivers, which is, I mean, kind of part of the deal, but we needed all of those trees for the fish that no one really thought about. And then we also caught all those fish. So most of the coaster population that was around just plummeted. And they weren't able to restock those rivers because they did so much deforestation. It wasn't a readily, easily fish to bring back. So instead, you can go to the next slide. We introduced steelhead. So lots of lake trout, lots of brook trout. The brook trout populations crashed. We brought in steelhead and brown trout in the 1890s. And then they slowly started to kind of get their groove and they started to populate on their own. And then in the 50s, we got invasive species like the sea lamprey. that primarily affected lake trout, but also affected steelhead. So because of that, we introduced salmon. So in the 60s, we introduced salmon. So we have king salmon, coho salmon, and pink salmon. Uh, there are 5 Pacific salmon. We have 3 of them. We do not have chum salmon or sockeye salmon. And then there's 1 Atlantic salmon called Atlantic. Okay, good. Yeah, good job. And those were populated, those were stocked at one period of time on the North Shore, but because they spawn in the fall and the North Shore relies on higher water levels, the Atlantics just didn't do very well. So we don't have Atlantics, chum or sockeye, but there are cohos, kings, and pinks. Many of you may have heard of a kamloops. That was another species that was introduced once the steelhead started to decline. The kamloops are it's kind of full circle. So there's a native rainbow trout, and then the migratory version of that is a steelhead. And then once a steelhead becomes landlocked and can't go back out to the lake, then that one is specifically called a kamloops. Those were stocked into Lake Superior to make more of a shore fishery that lasted throughout the winter. Long story short, those fish were hybridizing with the steelhead, and it just kind of hurt the overall natural reproduction of the steelhead. So there are no kamloops or loopers anymore. And then just kind of going through the years, there's been a little more stricter regulations before you could just keep, this was before my time, but I've heard stories of being able to keep a lot of steelhead, which to me is just wild. But it was a different time. But it's one of those things that back in the day, there was a bunch of coastal brook trout, and then they were overfished and it plummeted. So we are like, all right, let's put some steelhead in there. And they did really good. And then they were overfished and they plummeted. And then it's like, all right, well, let's put some kings in there. And so we've kind of gone through ups and downs. And you can kind of see, I'll show a little bit of fish numbers later on. It is just one of those things. So me personally, I'm a catch and release fisherman when I fish for steelhead. I urge you, even if you do catch a fish, so right now, the North Shore, catch and release only for steelhead. They are stocking steelhead. So if you catch a steelhead with a clipped adipose fin on the North Shore, technically you can keep it, but because those are genetically the same steelhead as our wild steelhead, they can spawn with the wild steelhead and produce more steelhead. So if your main goal is to catch a steelhead, I would recommend putting those fish back, so then we can catch them for longer. And then same with the South Shore on the Brule. You technically can keep one over 26. But just like I said before, it's one of those deals that I like catching steelhead. I like catching really big steelhead. So once they get to 26, those are the ones that I want to see in the river system, and I'm sure you guys do too. All right, so just quick little TU stuff, since this is a TU meeting. Some of the challenges that we have on the North Shore specifically is that because our North Shore rivers aren't spring fed, it relies heavily on cold water. And the way that we get cold water is primarily with shade from trees. That's what we have, a little bit of spring water, but it's mainly trees, and that's kind of what protects us from flooding, and that's what gives the fish a little more cool water. So I'm not gonna go, this isn't the fun part of this slide. It's just kind of the stuff that needs to get done. But Gitchigumi Trout Limited up in the Arrowhead is doing a lot of work, doing river restoration, just like you guys are down here, planting trees. We have an uptick in balsam budworm that's killing a lot of the conifers in the riparian corridors. So we're cutting a lot of those trees down, planting new ones, trying to protect that from floods and cold water and everything that's going on. And that trickles down. Most of this is in the upper, above the barriers brook trout water. but that's the same water that does get down into the migratory water, so it's important. So basic steelhead life cycle. You can see this first fish. So I was talking to a couple people already about going to the Brule and catching some small rainbow trout and some native fish. If you do go to the Brule or South Shore and you catch a rainbow trout, congratulations, you've caught a steelhead. Uh, it has not gone full circle, so it hasn't gone out to the lake, but it's still genetically a steelhead. So this is what I refer to as a smolt. So once a steelhead or a brown hatches, they go through their life cycle of alevin, fry, par, smolt, and then after this smolt, they go through a process called smoltification, where they turn from like a kind of rainbow-looking fish into a steelhead. So they get really shiny, they go out to the lake. So that's 2 years. They spend 2 years getting to about that big, and then they swim out to the lake, and they spend another 2 years getting bigger and bigger. Sometimes those fish will come back, specifically the males, when they're 3 years old. And this fish in the middle is referred to as a skipjack. It's kind of that teenage fish that's in the mid-teens. And they're just trying to get in and spawn with a pair of steelhead. And then if they survive, so sometimes it's a misconception on how old some of these fish are, and it's a little confusing on like, are those the ones that die after they spawn, or are those the ones that come back? So trout specifically spawn and live, brown trout and steelhead, and they will live until they're 7, 8, 9, 10 sometimes. I think there's been a couple reported that were 13, 14, so they can live quite a long time as long as they find enough food and aren't kept by any anglers. And then they can get up to this size, which on the right, that was one of my buddy's fish that was over 30 inches on the Brule from a couple years ago. So they do get pretty big. And then just quickly, for salmon, that's not my main target when I'm fishing, so I care more about the steelhead and browns. But salmon do die after they spawn. They typically live 3 years, and then they go up the river, they spend all their energy spawning, and then they die. So that includes kings, cohos, and pinks. All right. So North Shore, right now, what can you catch? I don't know, kind of crowd-wise, if you guys are more interested in South Shore versus North Shore. I'm going to cover North Shore, talk about when, where, what, all the details. Then I'm going to switch and cover a little more South Shore that's generally, especially in the fall, a little more of the focus. But if you are interested in going to the North Shore, you can primarily catch pinks. Pink salmon is the main target, and then coast or brook trout are kind of the secondary. For me, it's more the target. That's the fish that I want to catch, but there's less of them. The pinks, there's generally quite a few when they're in. The season doesn't last a super long time for them, but I'll go into that, I think, on the next slide. But you can also catch, there's occasional cohos, kings, steelhead on the North Shore. So if you're fishing for pinks, then all of a sudden it's just like, oh my gosh, something's happening. It's probably not a pink, it's probably a steelhead or a king or something else. Yeah. So when should you fish on the North Shore? It is a little trickier. Because the North Shore isn't spring fed, we don't get consistent flows, which means the fish aren't in the river at a specific time. General rule of thumb is the first major rain in September. We've already had quite a few rains, and the pinks are just starting to come in now, so it can be a little tricky. But end of September, early October is kind of the prime time for North Shore fish in general. And then on my website, I do have a link to all the North Shore river gauges and the Brule river gauge if you are interested in figuring out when the best time specifically for the North Shore is, or if the brule's blown out or something. I have a link with all that info. Just real quick, this fish was from a client a couple years ago on a mid-shore river on the North Shore. And if you notice, there's a little pink floy tag in there. So beautiful coaster brook trout. That fish was electrofished by the DNR. They put the tag in, so when you catch it, they can get some data on it. The Minnesota DNR is doing a coaster genetics project on brook trout, primarily trying to figure out if our coaster brook trout are genetically the same as our native above barriers brook trout. They haven't come out and said anything publicly about what they've found out, but I think it's safe to say they're probably the same fish. And I don't know if that's necessarily their coasters that were somehow in a flood event pushed above the barriers, or if there were native fish that always flush down into the lake and then turn into coasters. But it seems now that our primary coaster population is from our native brook trout that are getting flushed out to the lake, and then they just turn into coaster brook trout. There's no difference. Then they just have to survive, and there's generally more food, so they just get bigger and bigger. So where to find fish specifically on the North Shore? So they're in all of the rivers. There's not really a secret like, oh, go to this spot and there's not fish in this river. Once there's enough water and the temperature is all right for the pink salmon, they'll just go into the rivers. One thing to note is that steelhead specifically can jump waterfalls that are 7, 8, 9, maybe 10 feet tall. So if you see a waterfall that's this tall, there's a good chance that at the right flows, a steelhead can jump up and get above that, and you can still fish for migratory fish above that. And that is another thing in the spring on the North Shore. It's kind of cool to see. Sometimes you can go to some rivers, specifically in the Lester River, right in Duluth. You can look right over the bridge, and at the right time, you can watch the steelhead try to jump up. It's like a 7-foot falls down there, and it's a pretty cool sight. But pinks cannot jump that high. So if you've gone fishing on the North Shore, like I've caught a steelhead here, I'm going to catch a pink salmon here, they might not be able to get to that spot specifically. So for pink salmon, I tend to work from the mouth of the river up for most rivers. And unlike other migratory fish, where you're generally fishing deep, dirty water and you can't see the fish, I don't know if this is clear enough. Those aren't rocks. These are all salmon. There are piles of pink salmon in this picture. And they have a fairly white belly and they hang out in schools. So you might go to the river and you'll be like, can't catch one. And then you go up and like, oh, okay, they're right here. This is where all the pink salmon are. And you can try to catch them. They can be tricky to catch. Just a little word of warning. If you do go up and you try to catch pink salmon, sometimes they're just snappy and they will eat and you can see them and it's a great time. Other times you can see them and they will not eat and it can be fairly frustrating. But it's a cool sight anyways. But otherwise, if you see them, they're not biting, go to a deep hole where you can't see and try to catch a coaster or something else. General gear and techniques for North Shore. Most of you are probably driftless anglers. Bring your typical trout stuff for North Shore fishing. 3 to a 6 weight, standard fly line, 2 to 4X tippet, small nymphs. The same stuff that you'd use in the driftless. It should work for a pink salmon, 14s, 16s, maybe even 18s. And then my favorite is a streamer. It can be really hard to drift a little nymph in front of a pink salmon when it's in 1 foot of water and clear. But sometimes throwing in a streamer and stripping it away from them, they will not chase it, and then eventually one will break off and and hit the streamer. So that's my favorite way to catch pinks. All right, South Shore. Assuming this is a little more what you guys are here for, especially in the fall. So spring, you can fish South Shore and North Shore. There's steelhead on the North Shore and the South Shore. In the fall, if you want to catch steelhead, kings, cohos, the South Shore is kind of your best bet. Yeah. All right, so when to go for steelhead and browns and all these other migratory fish. Generally, the end of the summer. There's not really a specific date. I have a chart a little later that'll show you the kind of the best times, but they go in phases. So the browns show up first, then the kings and salmon, and then the steelhead, and that changes kind of year to year. But just one thing to note: the season ends November 15th. So you can't fish past November 15th. So that's kind of a hard deadline. And then October 1st, if you're fishing the Brule specifically, the upper river, so south of the town of Brule or Highway 2, is closed after October 1st. And then you can only fish from Highway 2 down to the mouth. So this is that chart that I was talking about. It shows the black bars are brown trout. So this is from last year. Brown trout were coming in probably 4th of July. So there's some migratory fish in like middle of summer. You can go try to catch them. I generally don't, just because it's so hot and there's other things to do. I start showing up September into October, and then kind of mid-November when they have to pry me from the river, is when I stop. So this is last year's data. The North Shore, we don't have any direct fish numbers other than creel surveys. So DNR guys will go out, ask you how many fish you caught, how long you've been fishing. On the Brule River specifically, there's a lamprey barrier that the fish have to go through a little fishway, and we count all the fish. So we don't get that data right away, but you can see there's 2,700 browns that came in last year, 3,000 Chinooks, which is same as king, 2,000 cohos, 4,000 steelhead. The Brule used to be coaster brook trout. And now last year there was 0 that at least made it past the barrier. There's probably some that are in the lower river. And then pink salmon, if you want to catch a pink, go to the North Shore. Don't go to the Brule. There's 8 of them in there. This year there might be 9 or 10, but you're kind of wasting your time. And then a few splake, which is probably the stocked splake. But there's a little bit of natural reproduction. My buddy that was holding that big steelhead in that other life cycles slide, also, he caught a tiger trout, which at the time, neither of us knew what that was. But it was a nice tiger trout. So a hybrid between a brown and a brook trout. So there's some cool fish up there. So this is just kind of showing where the numbers come from. I talked about that lamprey barrier on the lower Brule that all the fish have to go through. That was built in 1984. You might not be able to see that little picture at the bottom, but you can go to the next slide. So luckily, there is some intern at the Wisconsin DNR that sits and counts and measures and sexes every fish and will say, all right, 24-inch male steelhead, 32-inch female Chinook, 1 pink salmon. So it's not a real-time information, which would be nice to say like, okay, there's this many fish in now. But it's good information. It usually comes in the spring from last year, so we just got that data. Yeah. Where's the so where's the lamprey barrier? It's probably how many miles? Like 7 miles up, maybe. It's in the lower section. There's a little bit of water in between, but it's still in that lower migratory area. Yeah. They can go over that. The idea is they go through the fishway. We might be missing a couple fish, but the majority of them do go through. I think they just can't jump, and I don't know if I don't know specifically if they get.
Sorry, questions at the end, please.
Oh yeah. I don't know why the lampreys can't get up the river. So that last graph showed in a single year what the timing of what different species comes in the lake. And this is I think this is 30 years of data. So at the top, brown trout kind of peaked up there in 98, 2000, dropped, and then kind of peaked. And so last year, the numbers were lower than average for all three primary browns, cohos, and steelhead. But they're all, I mean, there's ups and downs. Yeah. Yeah, and then I'm not going to cover all this. There's basic sizing information too, and they go through, they can see how big these fish were. So an average brown, like 21 to 26 inches, coho 23 to 25, steelhead 20 to 25. I feel like the numbers in the last year or two have gone a little down for steelhead, but the sizes have gone up. In the past, if someone was just like, I got a 30-inch steelhead on the Brule, I would not believe them. But now, I mean, typical fishermen. Still, if someone's just like, I got a 30-inch steelhead, I probably won't believe you unless you show me a picture. But they are around. I just want to talk a little bit about where. So I'm not beating around the bush. The Brule is like kind of the river on the south shore. I'm sure most of you have already heard about it. It's fairly famous. It's the President's River. There are fish in other rivers. You don't have to just fish the Brule, but it's the one that I've spent the most time. So that's the one that I go to the most. There's a lot of water there. There's like 20 some different parking lots in the lower section where there's more migratory fish, generally from Highway 2 down to the mouth. And there's like 100 plus named holes plus some extra ones. Just a little word of warning, if you have fished it in the past, but that was maybe like 2018, 2019, COVID has changed some things. So during COVID, a lot of people went to the Brule that didn't necessarily know what they were doing, where they were going, and there was a lot of issues with the private property that is part of the Brule River. So there's people that own private property right in the middle on the river. There's houses and cabins right there. So just if you do go to the Brule and you see a private property sign, don't trespass. And if you go to the Brule and you can even see on a map on X or Trout Routes that this is a private section, be very careful around when you're fishing those spots because there are a handful of private sections that are still open, but it's getting close. And this is a special river to me. I want to fish it as long as I can and as many of the spots as I can. And I don't want to come here and just like, everyone go to the Brule. It's great. And then everyone's just like, oh, I went to this talk and Jason told me to come here. So just be careful when you go, be respectful. But yeah, I don't want to harp on it too much, but it is important. All right, getting into are we doing okay on time here? Yeah. So techniques, we're getting into the fun stuff now. So this is kind of what I really like about fly fishing in particular. So I'm going to talk about nymphing, throwing some streamers, swinging flies. That is not the only way to fish. You can fish with spinning gear, you can use center pins, you can tightline, you can do all of this different techniques. I am a fly fishing guide, and so I'm only going to tell you about the stuff that I know, and I'm not going to point you in the wrong direction on this other stuff that I don't know. So we're going to cover nymphing, streamers and swinging flies. So nymphing, I do have a rod, so try not to break it here. This is my standard migratory fish rod. This is a 10-foot, 7-weight rod. That's what I use on the Brule. That's what I use on the North Shore. I really like the length of it, especially when I'm fly fishing, because the longer the rod, it just makes it easier to cast. Specifically, it makes it easier to mend, which is probably the most important part of fly fishing for migratory fish. And then once you are hooked up to a fish, that little extra rod is just that little extra shock absorber. So you can fish with a 9-weight or a 9-foot. So typical like a 9-foot 8-weight is a very standard rod that you can use for bass fishing, pike fishing. If you have a 9-foot 8-weight, perfect. You don't have to buy a new rod. But if you are specifically like, this is my thing, I'm going to fly fish for migratory fish, having that extra foot of rod does make a big difference. And I prefer to fish with this. Pretty much, obviously, nymphing, floating line. I specifically like indicator lines. This is a Scientific Anglers Anadro line, which is their indicator line. It's the Mastery series. It's an $80 line, but I wouldn't buy the more expensive one if you're going to get something specific. This is my go-to. And then drag. Having a good drag on a reel is important. So if you're fishing for trout or bass, you rarely put the fish on the reel. Migratory fish, you definitely will put it on the reel and you want a good drag. If you're hooked up to a big fish, that's not the time to be like, oh man, I should have spent like $20 more and then I would have landed this fish instead of. So you don't have to go crazy with a rod. It doesn't have to be some like $1,000 seal drag, whatever. But just make sure it's a fairly competent reel. The breaking strength, don't read into the marketing. I don't crank down the reel. I have it fairly loose, but you do want one that's smooth. So if you go into a fly shop and kind of feel it, there's a term called the startup inertia, and that's kind of what I'm looking for. So it's not jerky and goes from like no drag to a lot. You want it kind of a smooth transition. So leader setup on this. We're going to get a little bit in the weeds here, but that's kind of why I like the steelheading part. I like nerding out on this. That's kind of why I got into fly fishing, because I did spin fishing. I was like, all right, I can go this lure or this lure, and then I just cast it out and it sits there. But I really like nerding out over this stuff, so I'm going to do a little bit of that. South Shore specifically on the Brule. So North Shore, one fly only for the lower migratory section. The Brule, you can have 2 flies. So because I have 2 flies, I generally have a shorter leader. You can buy or if you have a 9-foot, I generally cut those back a little bit. Let's see. General rule of thumb, I want my total leader length from end of my fly line down to the bottom fly to be roughly the length of my rod. If you get into a 11, 12, 13-foot leader, it'll be fine when you're fishing, but then you hook a fish and you usually don't want to reel the leader into the guides, and then you're going to have a hard time netting the fish. So that's kind of that rule. If you have a 9-foot rod, kind of stick with 9-foot. If you have a 10-foot rod, you can get a little bit longer. So generally 7.5-foot leader. I go down to, let's see if I can, this is going to be really hard to see. So end of the fly line, tapered leader down to a swivel. You can do a line-to-line connection. I think they're a pain. And then if you break off, you're just eating into your leader, and then you have to put on a new leader. So I go leader right to a swivel or a tippet ring. Does a couple of things. The swivel keeps your flies from twisting when you're casting, especially if you have a big stone fly. The other benefit is that I put all of my split shot or weight above the swivel, and that keeps my split shot from sliding down right next to your fly. So I have seen people, and I'm not giving you a hard time, man, I don't even want to talk about the first time I went to the Brule and just like stood in the middle of the river with my bass rod and just like slapping down. And like we all make mistakes. There are things that you should be doing, uh, some other things that are kind of up for interpretation. Um, but you don't want to just tie your fly right onto the end of your tapered leader. So it tapers down into the tippet, but I like nylon leaders since they are a little more buoyant. And then from the swivel down, I switched to fluorocarbon. So it's uh, more invisible to the fish. It's more dense, so it gets down. So that's kind of my system. And then just to note, everything tapers down. So generally I start with as heavy as a leader as I can, usually a 0x, or I'll build my own leaders, and then taper down. So your first fly is 1x, and then from your top fly to your bottom fly is 2x. That helps with casting and everything rolling out. And also, if your bottom fly gets hooked on a branch, you don't break both flies off. You just hopefully break one fly off, but part of the deal. Yeah. All right, so this is a little bit taken from, I don't know if many of you guys know Brent Knopbaum, the executive director of Minnesota Trout Unlimited, now good fishing buddy of mine. He kind of got me started in this kind of terminology of horizontal fishing and vertical fishing. So if you've gone to the Brule or other big rivers for migratory fish, you'll realize that it's not just one level and one speed. And it can be tricky when you go from one spot to another and you're fishing deep and you're fishing shallow. Um, so Brent specifically, I just got done fishing with him the last couple of days. He brings two rods with him. He brings one that's this rigging 1 style and one that's the rigging, it's covered up, rigging 3 or the vertical style. And if he's fishing the riffles up at the top, he'll use one rod. And if he's fishing a deep, slow section, he'll do the other. So the main difference is this rigging one is more your standard nymphing setup where your weight is on the bottom and your flies are kind of drifting up above. And this vertical setup is a little more like a center pin style setup if you've looked into that at all. So kind of staggered weights that holds the fly. Each one holds the next one a little bit deeper. And the goal there is instead of getting your weights dragging across the bottom, your flies are just on the bottom, and that's more productive in that slower water when you're just trying to get the fly in front of the fish instead of all the weight. I tend to fish this rigging 2 method most of the time. So a weight, usually 1 or 2 split shot, and then the swivel, and then 1 or 2 flies. Often a weighted top fly within. It depends for flies too. I'll go into flies later. I'm not gonna talk too much about that. All right. So talking about flies though, the Brule specifically has 2 types of stone flies, a giant stonefly or Turnarsis, and then a golden stonefly, which is Acronuria. And the main nymphs and stoneflies that I use to imitate those flies are like a superior X legs, which is a very common, popular fly, marabou tail, rubber legs, a Pat's rubber legs, Kaufman stone. Our giant stone flies do get giant. They can be like 2.5 inches long. So if you're fishing a big old stone fly, I guess this is one of the, I've tied some a little bit bigger, but this size 6 hook, like 3X long, so fairly big bugs. And then your Acronuria is more kind of your typical pheasant tail, prince nymph, hare's ear. So if you guys are fishing from the driftless and you want to go up and fish for migratory fish, they will eat the same stuff. If you have a size 14 pink squirrel, they will eat that. But if you fish with the pink squirrel with a 1X or a light gauge hook, you'll hook that fish, but you will not land it. So if you go fish for migratory fish, the patterns don't matter as much, but you want to upsize the gauge and get a specific hook that's going to be able to hold those fish. But generally size like 6 to 8 for stoneflies. Nymphs, I do a lot of 8 to 12s. I've caught them on 14s. They will eat smaller stuff, but then you just get into that. It's hard to find a size 18 with a heavy enough gauge that you can land those fish. So I tend to stick a little bit bigger. And then eggs, very important food source for migratory fish. In the fall, I've heard a lot of people say like, steelhead, they spawn in the spring, which I don't think I really covered. Sorry, real quick, going back to this life cycle thing. On the Brule, the steelhead come in the fall, they winter over, spawn in the spring. The browns come in the summer, spawn in late fall, leave after ice out. The salmon come in and they're spawning in the fall. So if the salmon are in and they are spawning, there are eggs in the system that the steelhead and browns and other salmon are eating. So typically I kind of fish a little more nymphs, stoneflies, and then I switch over to eggs a little later in the season. All right. I think I've done this presentation a couple years ago. I've talked about swing gear. I asked before how many people are interested in it. It's one of those like, there's a little bit of excitement sometimes. I'm just going to run through this quick, and then if you have questions about that at the end, ask me. So this is one of those things, if you're catching a ton of fish and you're just like, I just want to do the next step and make it harder, then you should try swinging flies because you will spend a lot of time fishing and very little time catching. Sometimes you'll catch fish, but for me, I tend to like doing that more and more now. It's just I don't know, there's something about it. You're not staring at an indicator, you're practicing your casting. There's a lot of just next things, just like the fly fishing where I got a little bored with the spin fishing and I did fly fishing. Now the two-handed is that next step up that's a little harder. It is really fun. It was kind of like that first fish that got me hooked, which is casting out, just like, again, oh, I've never seen that bird before. And then just your rod gets ripped out of your hand and it's just super exciting. So I do like swinging. Basic setup, you can fish a single-handed rod. You can throw just a streamer without having a dedicated like two-handed setup. You can also get a single-handed spay setup and use your single-handed rod to do this. But if you're going to do it a lot, I would recommend getting a two-handed rod, probably a switch rod, 11-foot, 7 weight. You can't go wrong with that. I like using the OPST Skagit heads and their laser line. Reel doesn't really matter. And then sink tips, just get a variety. The benefit of doing this swinging style system is it's not an integrated sink tip, that you have all of these different parts. So you can kind of pick your running line, you pick the weight of your head, you pick your sink tips, which can also be super confusing and frustrating. But once you get it kind of dialed in, it is fun. Then leader, 12 to 15 pound. They're not really leader shy, but you do want something heavy enough when they just grab it. Woolly buggers, egg sucking leeches, intruders. I didn't mention, I do have all of the flies that I typically use for migratory fish up here. So at the end, feel free to come up and take a look at some of this stuff. But for swinging flies, this is kind of your more like intruder style, just something big and gaudy that gets their attention is usually good, but they will eat small traditional stuff as well. All right, I think we're coming to the end, which is good because I'm going long. So 10 tips. This is probably the most like important of all of the slides saved for the end. So I've been doing enough guiding now that it's just like the same kind of things come up every time. And starting off first is fish the inside. So it's really easy. And I have a hard time with this too, that I'm like, oh, I could probably cast over there. So I'll go step in the water and just like rip out a bunch of line and hit the far bank. And then you're just like blowing out the whole hole because your line's slapping down and you're ripping the indicator out of the water. So the steelhead, they're a bigger fish. They are less finicky than a trout, but you still want to be as cautious as you can. So ease into it. Fish that I've caught a lot of fish like right where you would think you should stand. So right on that inside first, a couple drifts, then get in, and then kind of grid system out, get a little further, and then you can take a couple steps down inside, work a little bit more. There's definitely spots where the fish should be, but there's also, even me, I'm just like, why was there a fish there? So fish all the little nooks and crannies first. Walking speed water is just a general rule of thumb. So if you can picture yourself walking down the river at a pretty like standard pace, that's generally the speed of water that migratory fish want to be sitting in. It's not always the case because the water moves slower under the surface than on the top. Plus, if there's a rock, it creates a little cushion. So just general rule of thumb. Good line management. So this is casting, mending, all of that. If you are casting and you have too much slack out, everything gets a little clunky. So just when you're casting, nice, easy, smooth. And then, so presentation by depth and mending. Generally, you think of mending as you want a drag-free presentation so it looks good to the fish. But the other unlooked factor of having a good mend is that if you have drag on your indicator, not only are your flies getting pulled at an unrealistic speed, but it's pulling them up in the water column. So if you are throwing a bunch of weight and you have a really long distance between your indicator and your flies, you might not need to do that if you just mend a little bit better. So making sure you don't have any drag on that indicator will keep your flies at the bottom where the fish generally are. And then other than that, adjust your rig often. Once you've kind of figured out that mending part of it, you want to fish relatively deep. They can be in the shallow water, but generally I want my indicator kind of like ticking every once in a while so I know I'm on the bottom. Imagine where the fish is. So if you get up to the water, you don't see them. So fish a spot, kind of pick where you mend, and then if you don't get one there, maybe the fish is back there. So adjust the timing of your mends. The cast slow, kind of covered it before, just nice and easy. Let the fish run, for heaven's sake. This is a really tough one, especially if you're not used to fishing for migratory fish. These fish can go insane. And if you haven't done it before, it will blow your mind because you're just fishing and it's just like, man, is this ever going to happen? Are there even fish in here? And then as soon as you lose faith, your indicator goes down, you set the hook, and they will just explode and jump and run at your feet and then run away. And if you just like, oh, I need to get this fish, it's here, I'm just going to get it in the net, you'll break it off. So it's a lot of give and take. Set the hook, let the fish run, generally, unless it's getting into a wood pile, but and then they do get off. It's kind of like a maybe 50% thing that you hook one and sometimes it just pops off. It's part of the deal. And then last, just be patient. This isn't a going and just getting a bunch of numbers. You're hunting for generally like one, maybe two fish on a fantastic day, and just enjoy your time out there. I think that's all I got. So if you have any other questions, you can go to my website. You can reach out to me here. But yeah.
So if you're on Zoom, please put your questions in the chat and Eve will take care of those. But for questions here, just raise your hand. I'm going to come around with the microphone so that we know that the people on Zoom can hear the question. And then Jace can give us the answer that we're all looking for. So who wants to kick us off here in person?
Here, while you're thinking, I got one thing I skipped over. So rod is important. I didn't mention the net side of it. If you are catching a big fish, leave your driftless net at home. It's going to be more problems trying to fit a big migratory fish into it, getting the head and it falls out and you're slapping at it. So you also don't have to go get some super fancy net. There are bigger, somewhat cheaper nets. Just a quick shout out. This net was built by my buddy Jeff in Duluth at Damn Goods and Gear. He does this custom, so everyone is different. You can say how long you want the handle, how big the hoop size. This one specifically has wood from my wife's grandfather's sawmill and some ironwood from the Duluth boardwalk and the Superior elevator. So it's just a special story and a good little keepsake. But if you are looking for any size net, trout net, steelhead net, anything, I would look for Damn Goods and Gear, and Jeff's a good guy. Yeah, don't lose it. So if you find this net on the river, you know where I won't lose it. But
so any questions here in person? Number one, thank you for a fantastic presentation this evening. So
what is center pin fishing? And could you just describe how it's different?
That's a good question. So the question is, what is center pin fishing? I've never done it, so I don't know all the details, but generally center pin fishing it's a longer rod. Usually they're like 14 feet long. It looks like a big ice fishing reel. They're really expensive free spooling reels, so you'll fish with a lighter line, like 6-pound test. Instead of an indicator, use a float. It's basically a bobber, all the same kind of stuff. And then you fish that vertical method. So you need a little more split shot to hold the float down. Usually it's staggered split shot. And then you fish it kind of like you would fly fishing. It's just it's probably the most efficient way to fish, especially if you're in a big pool. You cast out and then you're just holding the line above the water. You don't have to mend. But then the issue is there's no drag. So once you hook a fish, your drag is just your palm on the reel. So some pros and cons. You don't have to buy fishing line all the time as it degrades. But I think those reels are like really expensive.
I'm intrigued by the fact that your rod is 10 feet long. Is there any time when you'd use a short rod?
Yes. So on the North Shore, there are times that I prefer a shorter rod, and that's just because the rivers may be shorter. On the South Shore, no, I'll never, if I have a 10-foot rod, I'm not going to fish a 9-foot rod ever. But on the North Shore, there's a lot of situations where you're fishing and it's a small river and you're fishing like at your feet, or there's overhanging trees. And if you have a longer rod, you set the hook, then your rod's in the trees. So there are instances where a shorter rod can be better. But for me, I have, if you ask my wife, too many rods now. But because I have a couple 10-foots that's what I'm going to use for migratory fish. Yeah. Oh, a couple.
Hey, Jason. Thanks for the presentation today. It was very informative and
Yeah, man.
fun to listen to. Unlike you, I did not come from any sort of background of fishing whatsoever, and I just started maybe a few years ago. So everything that I heard today was very informative, and I appreciate you sharing the information with us. Since I've started fishing, I've fished here in the Twin Cities. I've fished up on the Brule. I've fished up on the Nipigon. And one of the things that I heard from your presentation is that on the Brule in particular, it used to be all coaster brook trout, and there's none on there at all. So a friend of mine have been up on the Nipigon, and we target, brook trout on the rivers, which are great. But we also have fished coaster brook trout in Lake Superior and in the mouths of the rivers up there. So I was wondering if you could give us your perspective on, why do we have no brook trout down here, coaster brook trout that is, on the Brule in particular, and, perhaps other, river mouths or whatever. And they have so much up there.
Ooh, that is a good question. I have not specifically fished Nipigon. I know there's a lot of brook trout up there. I don't know necessarily what the numbers of other migratory fish are up in Nipigon. I know there's quite a few kings around there, and there's steelhead all the way up the shore. I would guess that it's primarily just there's other species that are over competing. And because we put all those other fish, may not be true, but just in the perspective of there used to be coasters all over the place down here. The other thing is, it's so North Shore specifically, the Nipigon River is such a big river that there's more water, and coaster brook trout spawn in the fall. And our lower North Shore rivers are so short that the coasters will go to spawn in the fall, and sometimes there's just no water. And a coaster, kind of similar to a steelhead or a brown, they have a life cycle where the smaller fish need to live in the rivers for multiple years before they go out to the lake, because then they'll just be lake trout food. That's kind of why our pink salmon does so good on the fall, because once a pink salmon hatches, it just goes out to the lake, and it doesn't really matter if there's no water for the fish to survive in the river system. So I would assume it's just because specifically Nipigon is such a big river, it allows for a better reproductive option for the coasters. And generally it's just the coasters are better the further up the shore, where there's a few more bigger rivers, like the Brule River, Arrowhead Brule, so there's two Brules, but there's just bigger rivers further up that allow for a better brook trout fishery. So that's mostly a guess, but that's what I'd say.
What kind of flies do you recommend for North Shore for pinks, maybe coasters, spring or fall? And then second question is, do lake trout come up towards the creek mouths or river mouths, and are they accessible with flies?
Yeah, good questions. Flies for pink salmon, typical trout stuff. So small eggs, small nymphs, small streamers, like a size 8 woolly bugger, perfect. You can experiment. I've caught them on, I like to tie flies as well, so I like experimenting, and I've caught pinks on all sorts of different weird, gaudy streamer stuff, but they don't get huge. The pink salmon on average are like 15 inches. It seems like Another thing I kind of skipped over on the pinks. Generally, pink life cycle is they come in the rivers every other year, but they do come in the rivers every year on the North Shore for whatever reason. They just got confused. There's a couple different groups doing it, but it seems like one year is more of a numbers year, and then the other year might be size year. So last year was definitely numbers. We'll see the pinks are just starting to show up. But yeah, smaller streamers for coasters and for pinks. I'd use kind of the same stuff. And then the question about lake trout, if they're accessible to catch if they come in closer to the rivers. So lake trout, as opposed to the rest of these, trout and salmon don't spawn in the rivers. They spawn in shallow shoals out in the lake. And the season closes for lake trout. I don't know the exact date. It's maybe at the end of the month. So end of September it closes. And that's kind of to protect their spawning primarily from people out in boats. You can catch them. Spring and fall is the best time to catch target lake trout. They're not in the rivers, but you can throw streamers in river mouths and catch lake trout doing that. So one kind of, I don't know if it's a secret, you can fish when the smelt are running in the spring. Lake trout will come in and eat smelt, and it's just like, oh, here's piles of smelt. So that's probably the best time if you're trying to catch a lake trout on the fly, is to fish the lake around river mouths or the beach when the smelt are running.
Is there any other questions here in person? We'll take one more in person that we can.
So we got 4 online, Brian, when you're ready.
Yeah, we'll do one more here and then we'll turn it over to you, Eve.
Okay.
In regards to how many rods you have, Bob Nasby says, if you know how many you have, you don't have enough. So, regarding the North Shore, you kind of started and said it was an April to May fishery.
Mm-hmm.
Is the fall fishing up there just dependent on the rainfall and what's happened? And we can check that out on your website.
Yep. Yeah. So it is generally end of September. The North Shore in the fall, generally end of September, early October. It can go further into the pinks, because they die. If you're specifically after pinks, they come in, you can target them for like 2 weeks, and then you come and it's just like lots of little zombies and they're falling apart and stuff. But there's still potentially coasters and steelhead and other fish beyond into October. There's no closed season on the North Shore. So if the rivers are open, you can go in November or December and try to catch a migratory fish on the North Shore if there's enough flow. Yeah.
Eve, we'll turn it over to you with online questions.
Okay, perfect. First of all, technical crew, the sound, image, everything was perfect tonight. So thank you. I know it's difficult. First time we do it at that location, so that's fantastic. Okay, so we got 4 questions. I'm going to start with a question from Brad. I put that question in early. So the question is, are the salmon predators for the sea lamprey?
The question is, are the salmon predators for the sea lamprey? I'm not sure if he means if the lamprey prey on the salmon or if the salmon eat the lamprey. The salmon aren't predators of the lamprey. The lamprey can affect the salmon. They primarily affect the lake trout just because there's more of them, and they tend to hang out a little bit deeper. I guess I don't know exactly why they affect the lake trout more than the salmon. I've caught steelhead and salmon with lamprey wounds, but it seems like lake trout's kind of the main thing that the lamprey target.
So, but a salmon won't go after the sea lamprey.
No.
Okay. Next question from Dale. I have a family event in Duluth this weekend. My 9-year-old grandson told me he wants to try fishing. Do you have some brief advice for what we might try a few hours in the Canal Park area or a short distance up the North Shore?
Yeah. So generally, I don't like to just say go to this river because I'm talking to quite a few people here. But for a 9-year-old, okay, everyone, don't listen. This is for a 9-year-old kid. I would say go to the Lester. It's right in Duluth. It's fairly accessible. It's not a large distance between the initial barrier, which is below like the London Bridge or Superior Street. And by this weekend, there may be some pink salmon. And that's a really good starting point. So if you are migratory fishing, if you've never done it before, if you're jumping right into like going to the Brule trying to catch a steelhead, it can be tough. So starting, especially for a younger kid, but anyone if you've never done this before, I would probably recommend going to the North Shore in general. Try your hand at some pinks. They still fight hard. You kind of get, especially some of the practice, doing the mending, setting the hook, fighting the fish on the reel, and then you can kind of graduate from there. But I would do Lester. Eventually, there will be pinks in the sucker and the knife and all of the lower shore rivers.
Trout in general,
For
just wants to go trout fishing, where would you go?
Oh, for trout fishing? For what region? 9-year-old Duluth trout fishing? Oh man, this is getting tough for yeah. So I'm talking to too many people to just mention like a river. On the North Shore, let's see, how should I? There's a lot of good spots. There's good brook trout fishing right in Duluth, so you don't have to go far. That's about as far as I'm gonna go. So I enjoy taking people, showing them how to do it, telling them all the information. But river specifically, like I would love to tell you, but then that could be the next guy's favorite spot, and then so I'm not going to say specific rivers, especially for trout. And that goes into another thing. I've fished the driftless just a little bit, and I've come down here and it just like blows me away. Just like, oh, there's like a pile of fish right here. On the North Shore, brook trout wise, it's a little tougher. There you could go fishing all day and you'll catch a couple fish. And so part of being in Trout Unlimited, it used to be a better fishery. There's a lot of things talking about planting trees, just fixing the habitat for the fish. We have climate change, like all this stuff is going on. So the brook trout's kind of a newer special thing that I think we need to put a little more focus on to try to help bring back. But yeah, there's some good stuff. You can catch brook trout right in town. Generally going up the shore though is a better bet.
Okay, I've got two more questions online. One is from Brian. So great talk. Jason first. Do you ever Euro nymph for steelhead in the Brule or for pink salmon on the North Shore? I've had some success doing this, but not a ton. What do you think?
Yeah, that is a good question. So Euro nymphing kind of bleeds into other forms of fly fishing. So there's tightline fishing, which is a very popular way to fish, especially on the North Shore, just because the rivers are generally faster and have quicker drop off, so you need more weight, and a fly line doesn't always get you to the fish. Euro nymphing specifically can work. I've done it just a little bit. For me on the North Shore, most of my rivers are very overhung with brush, and it's hard to get a long, light rod in most of it. So I don't do a lot of Euro nymphing specifically. And it's just kind of that, like, it is a good option. Like, so is center pinning, so is tight lining, so is spin fishing. For me specifically, I'm just trying to do one thing really well. In general, I don't care how anyone fishes. It may not be the way that I do it, and I might not have a really good, a lot of good advice for you, but as long as you're like fishing responsibly and respectfully, it's all the power to you. So I haven't had enough experience. I don't want to I do want to buy another rod. But we'll see. I'll probably get into it in a couple of years and I'll let you know.
Okay, one last question. Your flies barbless hook?
Good question. No. So yes and no. When I'm fishing personally, yes. When I'm guiding, no. If I'm spending all day trying to get one fish that jumps and spits the hook because I decided to put a barbless hook on, I don't feel good about that. So usually for steelhead, I'm still using, like, some of the hooks are fairly big. A lot of them are still like a size 12 with a little barb. I've never had an issue where it's just like hurting the fish getting the barb out. So the size of the fish compared to the size of the barb, I'm not too worried about. For you specifically, if you're fishing, that's a personal choice. I'm not worried if you're migratory fishing with a barb. But if I'm brook trout fishing, driftless fishing, yeah, definitely barbless. But
Okay, thank you. That's all we've got online, Brian.